Welcome in our Geopolitical Situation Room. Today we will talk about the Arctic. Now let's have a look. Of course, the history of the Arctic from a geopolitical point of view is very interesting. Actually, it all started with some discoveries by the Dutch, for instance. The Dutch around 1600 already made plans to try to explore new navigation routes because they were confronted by hostile Spanish and Portuguese ships. And it was, for instance, Willem Barents in 1594 and 1595 and again in 1596 when he did several missions towards the Nordic area, the Arctic seas. You might remember the Barents Sea. Well, it comes from there as well. Actually, his ship was stuck for a while in 1596 and he was forced to spend the winter in Novaya Zemlya. But if we then first look at, well, the Arctic today, ladies and gentlemen, this is a map that you're perhaps not so familiar with. It's a polar-centered map, so the world organized around the Nordic Sea. And if we look at that map, it has become politically significant only during the Cold War. You might remember Khrushchev as leader of the Soviet party in the Soviet Union, where he was boasting that his country was making missiles like sausages. You might remember also the 1950s when the Soviet Union launched their first Sputnik satellites in the atmosphere. And as a result of those developments, of course, the race, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States of America was further ignited. A man which you also may know, President Ronald Reagan, much before he became president, he was a Republican. As you know, he was also the governor of California, but he played a role in the so-called Committee on the Present Danger. And this Committee on the Present Danger was actually using these polar-centered maps to suggest that the Soviet Union and that the danger emanating from the Soviet Union was much closer to the United States than one normally would expect. Of course, at that time, the Soviet Union was already developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, and these missiles would, pass over the North Pole in a hypothetical scenario, over the North Pole, over Canada, and then reach their potential targets in the United States. And of course, similarly, the United States was then developing, and this already started under President Kennedy, and it was also planned already under Eisenhower, similar projects. Might know, for instance, the Titan missiles, the Titan 1, 2, and 3 missiles, intercontinental missiles during the Cold War that were supposed to reach the Soviet Union. And of course, like in the space program later, they had different sections that could break off, and then the missile would continue and re-enter the atmosphere. That's how we know the Arctic from the past, if you will. But lately, of course, that military dimension is still there. Currently in the Arctic, there's a militarization going on of the region. But of course, also there are several countries in the world, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Russian Federation as a successor state. They all have submarines operating in this region. But of course, things are now in a new context. The new context is, of course, climate change, where the ice of the Arctic is depleting. And this man, you might know him, he's Al Gore, the former vice president of the United States. Well, he suggested that the American submarines should be used also. Well, of course, they were already used during the Cold War to break through the ice, and then people could walk around. But the United States Army had, well, very detailed data over the ice. Here you see a submarine of the United States breaking through the ice. The US Army had already a lot of data over the past decades about how thick the ice was. And of course, Al Gore asked the US Army to release that data so it could be studied by scientists working on climate change, and that further spearheaded new projects with regard to climate change. Indeed, there is also, next to the climate change dimension, there's also, of course, the aspect that the ice is thawing in the region and that there are different claims by different countries. Take, for instance, Canada, which can, of course, make an important claim in this region. The United States is not very much an Arctic nation. It only has Alaska. As you know, I believe in 1867, they bought Alaska from the then Russian Empire because the Russians thought, well, it was a useless piece of real estate. But of course, later on, oil was found. So Alaska became more important later on from a geopolitical and geostrategic point of view. This is the Russian Federation, the biggest chunk of real estate in the world, you could say. I believe 9 time zones, so it's an enormous country and can, of course, and I will talk about that in a minute, can, of course, make even bigger claims on the Arctic. Then we have some other countries. We have Denmark over here, a small piece of real estate, but they have, of course, still the sovereignty over Greenland, and Greenland is, of course, very important. And then the last really important Arctic nation we should discuss also, of course, is Norway. All these countries play a role. And of course, this is the Arctic Circle. This is the region where we are talking about. Because of climate change, now these Arctic nations are making all kinds of claims over that region. Of course, this is becoming a kind of scramble for the Arctic, which will, of course, change the map of the world in a very thorough way. It will also affect the wildlife. Symbolically here you have the ice bears, but of course the rest of the wildlife will also severely undergo severe changes. Because this is climate data from NOAA, the satellites. This is March 1985, this is March 2018. And what you clearly see over here when you compare is that the surface ice during the month of March is already, well, thawing quite substantially. It's not only superficially, but also in terms of volume, it's even more dramatic. Now, we are all talking about climate change. As you know, I believe that since the industrial age, the average temperature of the planet, which is always measured at the equator, has risen, I believe, 1.2, 1.3 degrees Celsius, but it is measured at the equator. 1 degree at the equator is 9 degrees at the poles. And when you take that into account, you start understanding what is really happening. Of course, with runaway climate change, as you know, we all want to keep it under 2 degrees, but 2 degrees on average measured at the equator is still 18 degrees in this region. So inevitably, this region will start opening up, and of course, it will make those developments much more interesting in terms of two first dimensions, of course. All kinds of new passages that will open up, more economic activity, more tourism activity, military activity also, of course. And of course, this will have also environmental consequences. Now, of course, what is also important, additionally, is that there are a lot of natural resources in the region that are still untapped. Analysts tell us that about 25% of the remaining oil and natural gas finds that there are potentially in this Arctic region, and you see them here. This is from the US Geological Survey. You see them mapped over here, at least those deposits that we know of. Legally speaking, there is the UNCLOS Treaty, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, which talks about the fact that countries can claim 200 nautical miles of their coast as an exclusive economic zone. Moreover, if they can somehow prove that there are underwater ridges, then they can claim even a bigger chunk of exclusive economic zone. And that is what is already happening, has been happening the last 10 years. This is a more detailed map from the University of Durham, and also including data from the United Nations. These are these exclusive economic zones of 200 nautical miles of the coast. What you see is that then a donut hole, so a hole, if you will, legally speaking, still remains. This is the donut hole over here. So you see it clearly. It's not clear whose possession it is. Now, the Russians, of course, they are saying, if we look at it more in detail again, the Russians are saying there is here a Lomonosov Ridge that is actually connected underwater with the Russian motherland, with the mainland, if you will. And based upon that analysis, and they've done geological surveys, they are claiming almost half of the North Pole, which is, of course, rather dramatic. So they're saying this is all Russian. As a response to that, the United States is also doing their own surveys, but they can't claim too much, of course. And there is Canada, which of course can claim quite a lot, and there's still a question mark over this part of the donut hole. At the same time, Denmark is claiming a chunk, of course, but there is still some issues with regard to this more southern part of the donut hole. And as you see, there's also Norway with another disputed area between the Russian Federation and Norway. And of course, all these countries have been developing surveys, they've done marine geology, etc. They've looked into the area, and they now are making dossiers which they will be filing to the United Nations. But of course, it is not very likely that a bunch of bureaucrats at the UN in New York are going to discuss this and decide this. This is a political matter. And of course, this explains the increasing militarization of the region. Because of course, the Russian Federation is only the only one that really has an Arctic army that is being upgraded as we speak. And of course, they will probably create a new de facto situation in the area. Now, this is of course Lavrov talking about, I believe this is 2007, talking about the Arctic. This is footage from Russia Today from 2007, because of course at that particular moment in time, the Russians almost symbolically sent a submarine over there, and they planted a Russian titanium flag on the bottom of the North Pole, claiming, well, this chunk of real estate over here, this is Russian territory, and this is part of the bigger strategy of Mr. Vladimir Putin. And of course, if you look here at the geostrategic situation, These areas are thawing. Every summer they come open, and former Cold War, so former Soviet bases, are now being reinstated by the Russian Federation. There is Rogachevo, for instance. There is Kotelny. These are small bases that are gradually being developed. And of course, the Russians also have an Arctic army. They are probably thinking that over the coming decades, there will be military conflict over this area. And this area is, of course, important because there's also a northeastern passage. This is the northeastern passage. Now, the traditional routes, which I'm from Antwerp, by the way, it's a harbor city. We're always competing with Rotterdam. So I'm always jokingly saying to my students, a mistake was made. It's not Rotterdam as end destination, but Antwerp. But anyway, next to that joke, we see that, of course, many ships depart from Asia. Traditionally, they would take the route of the Suez Canal through here towards Rotterdam or Antwerp. Nowadays, they could go through the North Sea route. And if they would go through the North Sea route, then it would be much shorter. As you see, 35 days compared to 48 days. So that's already quite a difference. So this is a more, well, economically more viable route, if you will. Now, if we look at the other nations, the Chinese, well, the Chinese have said that they want a stake in the action, if you will. If you look at the Chinese, they've already done in 1997, 2003, 2008 and 2010, they've done so-called exploration missions towards the Arctic. And then later on, if you look at the situation later on, there's, for instance, the famous quote by Admiral Jin Zhu, who stated, "The Arctic belongs to all people around the world." And China also renewed its interest. It has sent ships to the region as recently as 2018. Moreover, China is commissioning new ships, nuclear powered ships, and they're talking about a so-called Polar Silk Road. So it is clear China wants a piece of the action, wants to be there. There's also an entity we call the Arctic Council, and in that Arctic Council, China would like to be an observer, would like to be very much interested in the region and take decisions. Now, next to the Northeastern Passage, there is also the Northwestern Passage, and this is it. This is Canada, of course. These are all waters that normally are full with ice, but in the new situation, of course, here it is again. In the new situation, we see that new international trade routes could open up. In the past, the Americans have stated that, well, that they're actually quite interested in that particular region, and they actually are stating, no, these are not, well, internal waters of Canada, these are international waters, and they would like to use them for their own ships in the future. So a conflict between the United States and Canada over this Northwestern Passage might also develop in the upcoming years. If we then look towards the United States, Mrs. Clinton, when she was Secretary of State in the Obama administration, visited the region. And she said, from a strategic point of view, the Arctic is of increasing geopolitical importance. And we, the United States, want to work together with Norway and the Arctic Council over the area. new sustainable development, she was saying, but actually, if you read her in between the lines, and she almost said it openly, the US is especially interested in the natural resources in the region. And under the Obama government, a new strategy for the Arctic region was developed, because he was saying it's so important for the United States for the future. It's from 2013. First, US's strategic interests should be advanced, consistent with international law. The US should be able, US ships should be able to operate in the region, also because of travel, commerce, touristic aspects, etc. But he was also talking about responsible Arctic region stewardship, so managing the resources, protecting them, and then a third dimension, here it is, strengthen international cooperation through multilateral organizations and the Arctic Council. Of course, that multilateral dimension has disappeared, especially under this man, President Donald Trump, because President Donald Trump was especially interested in this chunk of real estate. By the way, in our Mercator maps, Greenland is always exaggerated. So the higher you go up the latitudes, the more exaggeration there is. So actually Greenland is a little bit smaller in reality. But Trump was, of course, very much interested in the natural resources that are available in Greenland. We'll look at them in a minute. And he wanted literally to buy Greenland, just a little bit like Alaska. It, by the way, already was contemplated in the past. It was contemplated in 1867. I believe under the Truman administration, there was also an idea to perhaps buy Greenland, but that was part of a strategy in the Cold War. This is the Danish Prime Minister, and he literally tweeted, "This has to be an April Fool's joke, totally out of season." And actually, because of that, Trump in August 2019 didn't want to do an official visit anymore to Copenhagen. Let's look at Greenland, and this is a map by Thomas Mott from the University of Georgia. And you see here the thawing, and the thawing is especially in all the border areas, so where Greenland connects. This is ice, land-based ice, but there is also ice that is connected to the sea, especially these regions over here, and especially also over here. This is thawing very much. You have melt days of over 100 days, and this process is increasing. This is quite recent data from November 2019. Let's look at the natural deposits of Greenland, and as a source, but there are many sources, but a good source and a good website you could choose to research is the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland. Based upon those elements, I've tried to draw my own map. What is available? Oil, for instance. In different parts also of the coast of Greenland, there is oil. There's probably natural gas. There are several attempts at finding natural gas. Interestingly enough, there is uranium, and there are some projects going on to test out whether it's possible to mine uranium. Interestingly enough, the Chinese are also very interested in that. There is gold. So if you're a gold digger, book your flight to Greenland. Diamonds, there's one location where potentially there's diamonds also. Lead, copper, you see all in this region where there is thawing going on. And then last but not least, for those that are interested in the renewable energy era, rare earth materials. So really, ladies and gentlemen, Greenland is a bonanza, Hence, this is the reason why Donald Trump is very much interested in Greenland. And hence, now he has also decided to set up a US consulate, very interestingly enough, in Greenland. To end, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about some scenarios for the future of Arctic governance. A very interesting article, or paper, which I very much recommended to everyone, is written by Christoph Humbrick and Klaus Dieter Wolf. It is called From Meltdown to Showdown, Challenges and Options for Governance in the Arctic, and it is published by the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. They developed several scenarios for the governance of the region. Scenario number one is what they call a cooled down relationships in the Arctic and minimal cooperation. In this scenario, there's a lot of nationalism going on. Countries are just taking what they want, if you will, and there is not so much cooperation going on. It's not a very likely scenario, but it's also not a very desirable scenario. But this is, you could say, nationalism on speed. There's a second scenario, nationalization, but then within the framework of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, the UNCLOS Treaty. And in this scenario, the Arctic states are extend their maritime exclusive economic zones, but they cooperate within international law, if you will. But that cooperation is rather limited. Scenario number three, also very interesting. So this is the opposite of nationalism. An Arctic treaty mimicking the Antarctica Treaty. As you know, Antarctica is a whole other region, and this has been decided in the past that this is part of the whole of humankind. So in that sense, it is common human heritage, and it cannot be exploited that very much. But I think this is not a very likely scenario because we all have these border states in the Arctic. But perhaps some ideas from that Antarctica treaty can be used. If we look at scenario number four, an Arctic treaty as a regional seas convention. Now this is already becoming a bit more likely. This is talking about for instance, the Arctic region. There is also a gathering of countries there. The paper talks about the OSPAR Convention, and this is the Convention for the Protection of the Marine Environment in the northeast of the Atlantic. This could be seen as a kind of example, a precedent that could be copied and transported, if you will, to the Arctic region. There's a little bit of a problem with the indigenous peoples, how would they be represented, but this is indeed, again, an interesting scenario. Two more scenarios to go. Scenario number 5, actor-centered cooperation in an Arctic regional organization based upon the Arctic Council. So then you would use the Arctic Council, you beef it up, you have states being represented in that Arctic Council, it already exists, but then you would also include indigenous people, the scientific community, NGOs, other entities, and you govern it together. It's an interesting scenario. Last scenario is an integrated multi-level governance in the Arctic. You would look at different functional aspects, energy, environment, the rights of indigenous people, and you would find tailor-made solutions for each of those functional domains. A very interesting paper which I very much recommend that you would read. This, ladies and gentlemen, concludes our overview. it gives you a good idea about what's happening in the Arctic, and based upon this, you can do your further own analysis. Thank you very much and see you next time. Bye.